Right now, there is a war going on in Africa. Usually when we say war, it means two or more countries fighting with arms and armaments against each other. But that's not what we are talking about. This war is a war of political power, influence, and ideas, and it's not between two African countries. No, it's between the West, that's the United States, and Europe and the East, notably China. This war has been going on for some time now, but in recent times, it has become more obvious. These two sides are fighting on who would be the major political influence in Africa with easy access to its minerals. And while all this is going on, Africa is just sitting and watching, waiting for which side will win the fight and dominate it again. The question now is, who will win this war, and should Africa just sit back and allow itself to be dominated by whoever wins the war? Let's find out. Just a few days ago, the Forum on the China-Africa Cooperation, which began on September 4th in Beijing, China ended on September 6, 2024. The purpose of the forum was for China to launch a new phase of its partnership with the African continent, strengthening cooperation, particularly in economic relations and political position. The President of China, President Xi Jinping, attended the opening ceremony of the summit, where he delivered a keynote speech, welcoming delegates and leaders of African countries present at the summit. According to Mohammed Khalil, president of the Morocco-China Friendship Exchange Association, the forum is taking place amidst highly turbulent global circumstances, including the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israeli war on Gaza, which threatens to escalate into a broader conflict in the Middle East. He said, "We are witnessing many African countries facing instability, such as Sudan and others that have experienced military coups and rebellions against the West, accused of exploiting Africa's resources." However, Kali believes that China is an alternative partner focused on building rather than destruction, and on shared development under the win-win principle. He also noted that there is a strong historical tie between China and Africa, noting that China played a significant role in helping African nations gain independence from colonialism. Now, during the summit, the president of China, President Xi Jinping, pledged to step up China's support across the African continent with funding of almost $51 billion over the next 3 years, and this funding will back more infrastructural projects and create at least 1 million jobs. Speaking to the 50 African delegates gathered at the summit, President Xi further stated that China is ready to step up cooperation with Africa in industry, agriculture, infrastructure, trade, and investment. In addition to this, China also promised to carry out 3 times as many infrastructure projects across Africa, although the projects would no longer be massive projects like before. Instead, China intends to focus on small and beautiful schemes based around selling advanced and green technologies in which Chinese firms have invested heavily. From this, we can see that Africa is set to receive more financing from China, even though the majority of it would be in infrastructure development through credit lines, investment by Chinese companies, and military aid. However, even though China promises to lend more funding to Africa, it is important to note that during the last China-Africa summit held in 2021, China pledged to buy $300 billion worth of African goods, yet that pledge has still not been fulfilled. And during this year's summit, President Xi did not reiterate the pledge made during the last summit, and neither did he say if there was any plan to fulfill the pledge. Now, amidst all these, the West, that is the United States and Europe, has expressed their anxiety over China's increasing activity in Africa. According to Ahmed Abdullah Faris, the Secretary General of the African and Arab Affairs Association, even before the China-Africa Cooperation Summit began, tension and concern began to grow among American and European politicians. Faris noted that before the summit began, the West began to spread toxic news regarding China's interest in Africa, and they did this to sabotage the summit before it began. Specifically, Faris noted that Western media and research centers published articles and media reports which alleged that China is trying to dominate Africa and trap it in a debt crisis to exploit it and violate its sovereignty. A good example was Coin Tribune, a French media outlet which reported that China does not only provide loans to African countries to build projects, but also imposes control over them if they fail to repay their debts. In another report, the French website mentioned Sri Lanka as an example, which was forced to hand over the Hambantota port to China after failing to repay its debts. The news outlet further added that China is allegedly excessively exploiting Africa's natural resources for its own benefit, leaving African nations dependent on Chinese investments without achieving real sustainable development. The question is this narrative correct? Is China truly exploiting Africa? Before we answer this question, let's get something straight. The reason why the West is pushing this narrative is because it has become obvious to them that Africa is leaning more towards China and not the West. You see, after the independence of African countries, most African countries chose to align with the West and Europe by default, making the West the traditional partners of Africa. Africa depended on the West for everything from trade, finances, and even security. When African countries need loans, they go straight to Western financial institutions, the World Bank and IMF. When Africa needs to import and export, it does so mostly with the West, and when it needs security assistance, it is the West that Africa goes to. This arrangement firstly enforced the narrative that Africa is a continent that always needs help and has nothing to offer. Secondly, this arrangement, even though it looked like Africa was always going to the West for help, opened the way for the West to massively exploit African countries and undermine their sovereignty. Take, for instance, security. The West has always been Africa's partner in terms of security, and that's why whenever any African country is in need of help in terms of security, the West always steps in. However, if you take a look at all the countries that have asked for help from the West to deal with the insecurity in the country, you would observe that till today, all these countries are still fighting the same insecurity, and the situation has even grown worse. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, the KAR, Sudan, and Libya are all perfect examples of this scenario. The only thing the West has succeeded in doing is setting up their military bases, which cements its military influence across the continent. Financial assistance is another example of the one-sided relationship Africa has with the West. When Africa needs financial assistance in terms of loans, it goes to the World Bank, or IMF, which are Western-dominated institutions. Firstly, these institutions agree to grant loans to Africa, but with a very high interest rate that is higher than what it would give to a Western country seeking a loan. It's as if these institutions deliberately want Africa to be forever indebted to it, because most of the time, African countries end up not paying the debt, and the interest begins to accumulate until it gets to a point that paying back seems impossible. If you check the statistics, most African countries are heavily indebted to the West, World Bank, and IMF more than they are indebted to any other country, including China. Secondly, these loans usually come with conditions, either political or economic conditions. Sometimes in exchange for loans, African countries are required to implement economic policies that reflect Western beliefs and ideas, but which are detrimental to the economic condition of that country. A good example of this is the Structural Adjustment Program, which is still affecting many African countries today. Other times, the conditions are political. African countries will have to support the political ideas of the West, either in their countries or on the international stage, in exchange for the loans. So you can see why African countries are shifting away from the West. It has become obvious to the leaders that Western relationship with Africa is based on one-sided benefit. Now, instead of the West changing their approach, they have decided to play the blame game, casting China as the villain. However, as Faris has argued, the debt trap narrative promoted by America and Europe is real, but created by the United States and its allies. Reports show that the main lender to African countries is the IMF, the US, European countries, and European lenders, which accounts for 66% of Africa's total debt. China, on the other hand, accounts for only 11%. So, who created the debt trap? It's the West. Faris also revealed that Western and European countries often avoid reducing the debt burdens of African countries under the pretext that the common European policies of the Paris Club do not align with Africa. What the West does instead to relieve Africa's debt is to play a political game whereby efforts to relieve Africa's debt are now tied to conditions and demands imposed on African governments. In contrast, however, China provides funding without any political conditions, which is why it enjoys widespread acceptance across Africa. Now, does China have an ulterior motive in trying to strengthen its relation with Africa? The answer is yes. China, like the US, wants to build and increase its influence across the African continent, and thereby the global stage. However, its bilateral relations with Africa are far better than that of Africa's relation with the West. To an extent, Africa has benefited tremendously from China's relations, especially in terms of infrastructure. The fact is that the West is afraid that China will play an important role in transforming African countries into productive nations, leveraging China's industrial progress by utilizing Africa's resources, and they do not want that. It is now left for African countries to determine how they will play the game and who they will side with in this war between the West and China. But the important thing is that African countries should not sit idly by and watch another country, be it China, the US, or Europe, determine its destiny. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.